is spent in worship service on the minor prophets. And so we're on number 11 tonight, and Lord's willing, next Sunday night we'll do the last one. My objective is not to make you a Bible scholar on the Old Testament minor prophets. First of all, I'm not a scholar on them. And secondly, the emphasis on most of these minor prophets is to the Jews before the coming of Christ. Quickly, let's go back for just a moment and review some history very briefly. We know that the kingdom of Israel was divided into two kingdoms after the death of Solomon. And the northern kingdom is Israel, the southern kingdom is Judah. And ultimately the northern kingdom became so wicked that God allowed the Assyrians to take them into captivity, and they have never been heard from again. They've been assimilated into the Assyrian population. So if you went to Syria today, there are people living there that have Jewish blood in their veins, but they're not aware of it. The southern kingdom is Judah. It's the smallest of the two. And they became so wicked, God warned them over and over again about their wickedness. And he sent prophet after prophet to warn them, unless they repented of their sins and their misconduct, that he would allow them to go into captivity. And the minor prophets, some of the ones, the early ones, are some of those prophets that God sent to warn Judah about their sin. Well, they didn't heed it, of course. And ultimately they were taken into captivity by the Babylonians or the Chaldeans. Same people, just different name for them. Chaldea is the name of the area, and their capital was Babylon, so, the one and the same. Now, last week we did Haggai, a little tiny book, 2 chapters, I think a total of 38 verses. And Haggai, after 70 years in Babylon, came back to Jerusalem. There was no Jerusalem there when he came back. The Babylonians had destroyed everything except a portion of the wall of the old temple, which of course today is called the Wailing Wall. The Jews go there to pray and so forth. And they were under the leadership of Zerubbabel. You spell that and you can get an A. Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel began rebuilding the foundation for a new temple. And they worked and they did a pretty good job of building a foundation. But after they built the foundation, there was a lot of opposition to them from the natives that were still left there. Now, if you want to read all that story, go to the book of Ezra, and Ezra gives you the story. So after they built the foundation, for 16 years they didn't do anything. They were discouraged. It was hard to get material. They didn't have the resources. They went into a deserted land for the most part, and then the people that were living there were against them. Haggai last week, 2 weeks ago now, encouraged them to start working again. What's most interesting about Haggai is that he gives us the dates that he did his teaching. Of all of the Old Testament books, the dates are really interesting. He dates it according to the reign of the Persian king, and history has recorded the dates of the Persian king. So he says, in the 2nd year, the 4th month of King Darius or whoever, I did this. So it's wonderful that we can date the book of Haggai down to the exact day, because he said the 28th day of the 4th month of the 2nd year of the reign of King Darius. That's Haggai. Now, tonight we're in Zechariah. And Zechariah was a contemporary with Haggai. And they did their work at the same time. Except Haggai came first, and about 2 months later came Zechariah. So, no problem there. We know when Zechariah did his teaching. Now, the book of Zechariah is the most difficult book of the minor prophets to understand. And we'll get to that in a moment. And I'm not here tonight to tell you everything that Zechariah says in 14 chapters. I can't do it because I don't know. But there are some very important things about Zechariah that makes him unique. Now, first of all, the scripture says, and Zechariah writing this records it, that he had a revelation or a vision or whatever term you want to use from God, who told him to help Haggai get these people motivated to build the temple. 2 months later, God sent him some visions. This is what makes Zechariah difficult. I don't have this memorized, so that's why I have it here in front of me. God gave him 8 visions. Now, if I started right now, in about an hour, we'd be through those by just listing them and then trying to figure out the message. Some of the messages we have a difficult time understanding, but the messages in these visions were all encouragement to the Jews to get to work. Okay? And I'm going to be so maybe unkind as to give you the visions, the names that are given to the visions. And when I do that, you're going to think immediately of the book of Revelation. Okay? Vision 1. The rider on a red horse with red and sorrow on white horses behind him. Now you can read that. It's in the first chapter, starts in verse 7. And the historians who know far more about this than I do conclude that this is a vision describing the destruction of the peoples that have offended the Jews and have hindered the work, and that the Lord is going to take pity on them and allow Jerusalem to rebuild the temple. I'm going to go that fast with them because it's a lot. The second vision is the vision of the 4 horns and the 4 smiths. Smiths referring to blacksmiths. The 4 horns representing power and the blacksmiths representing destruction. And most likely God here is telling the Jews, I destroyed the countries that destroyed you to start with, including the Babylonians and the others. Number 3, the man with a measuring line. Sometimes it's called the man with the plumb line. I think everybody in the room knows what a plumb line is. And as you read through that vision, it's the idea that Jerusalem, remember when the Jews were destroyed and Jerusalem was destroyed, Nebuchadnezzar tore down the walls. When they rebuilt Jerusalem, that kind of wall didn't exist anymore. The next one, in order to understand this one quickly, one of the priests that came back from Babylon was Joshua. This is not Joshua that led the children of Israel into the promised land. This is Joshua, a priest. And it's called the brand, like a branding iron, plucked out of the burning. And this one we understand pretty well. Satan is accusing Joshua of being unfit to be a priest because he has filthy garments. Now, the filthy garments aren't clothes. It's the filth of sin and so forth. And there's Satan accusing Joshua of being unfit before God. And in the end, God says, okay, I will put clean garments on him, and he will be the clean priest. Then comes the golden candlesticks with 7 lamps and 2 olive trees. You're getting a lot out of this, aren't you? I can tell. You see, doesn't it sound Revelation? The next one is the flying scroll. Question about the filth of the land, referring to sin. And the flying scroll goes flying over Israel, the new Israel, and makes the land clean again. Next is the woman sitting in an epid. An epid is a bowl that holds about 7 gallons, I think, and she's sitting there, and she's representing evil, and she ends up in Babylon where evil's going to reign. The last one, number 8. The 4 chariots from between the copper mountains to go forth to patrol the earth, referring to the idea that God is going to protect them. You see why this is tough stuff? And what meaning does it have to us? Doesn't have a whole lot. It's to the Jews of that time that are coming back to Jerusalem to rebuild the city. One of the things that this prophet speaks about, and let's do a little math here quickly. If you were 4 years old when Judea was taken into Babylonian captivity, you are now what? 74. So let's say you've got the strength to get from Babylon back to Jerusalem, and at 4 years old you remember your mother taking you into the temple, and they're building a new temple, and what's the first thing you're going to realize? The new one is not as good or big as the old one. And there were other individuals that had not seen the old temple, but they'd been told about its majesty and its gold and all of the other things that Solomon put in it. And they were disappointed about the new temple that is being built. It's not as big, doesn't have all of the wealth in it. And so one of the reasons for the visions of this man Zechariah is that God's going to use this new temple in a different way, and it's going to outshine the old one. Now, did that happen? Well, one of the things, and we'll get back to that in a moment, the rest of Zechariah is important to us. In the book of Isaiah and in the book of Jeremiah, there are prophecies concerning the coming Messiah. And in both of those books, they don't call him the Messiah. They don't call him Jesus Christ. But they speak of the fact that he will be a Messiah and that he's going to make major changes in the world. But they have a name for him. I didn't look it up, but I think today, if you would turn to your Old Testament book and read in those 2 prophecies, the word they use, and I know the word is there, but I don't know if they capitalize it or not. They call him the branch. The branch, the branch. The idea from that, and Zechariah makes it clear, Jerry's trying to chop down a tree. If you haven't seen it, go by his house. You're not through, are you, Jerry?
I might be. I might cover
That's what I told you to do the other day. One of the reasons, and I got one of those in my yard too, Jerry. Mine is a locust tree, and it's been cut down several years. But there are locust trees springing up in the yard like thistles. And Kathy mows them down every week. The idea is that the nation of Israel has been chopped down, right? Destroyed. In the destruction of all of that, everything's gone, but the root is still there, right? And these prophets speak of the root of Judah, the root of Jesse. Okay? The root of Jesse. Remember who Jesse is? David's father. Jesse's gone. David's kingdom's gone. But the root is still there, and Jesus Christ comes from the line of Jesse and David. In other words, all of it's gone, but the root is still there, and Jesus is called in those books, including Zechariah, the branch. The branch. Jesus Christ. Now, when Christ came, the second temple was still there. The one they're building when Zechariah was alive. And Jesus did his teaching in the temple. The temple became the center where Christ came to worship. Remember, he's Jewish. And remember, when Christ was crucified, resurrected from the dead, the church was established. Where did it meet? Porch yard of the porch area of the temple. So the old temple is long gone with all of its physical beauty. But the new temple, which was inferior in looks, became the center of early New Testament Christianity. Okay? Now, I want to do this because it's important to us. Prophecies of the coming of Christ are very interesting. Remember that when we had Micah, I don't know how many weeks it's been, when we studied Micah, one of the prophecies concerning Christ was that he was going to be born where? Where did Micah say Christ was going to be born? In Bethlehem. And obviously, that was fulfilled to a T. Except those that were considered his parents didn't live there. Where did they live? They lived in Nazareth, which is way up north. But it just happened because Augustus Caesar demanded that they be taxed, and you had to go back to your hometown, and they went back to Bethlehem, and while there, Mary gave birth. Christ was born in Bethlehem. And you know something? When the wise men came looking for Christ, the Jews, who were the great teachers among Judaism, said, let us look in the book and see where it says he's going to be born. And they are the ones that told the wise men, go down to Bethlehem, that's where he's going to be born. You know, later they couldn't accept Christ as the Messiah, but yet they could figure out where he was going to be born. Bethlehem. Now, Zechariah is the second most quoted book in the New Testament related to the prophecy of the coming of Christ. And we're going to look at some of those right now. Okay. First of all, in Jeremiah and also in Isaiah, as I said a moment ago, and in Zechariah, Christ is spoken of as the branch of Jesse. Now, in the New Testament, there are several statements made that Christ is from the household of Jesse. And I'm not going to give all those to you. Zechariah also speaks in the 9th chapter and the 9th verse that this new king, Jesus Christ the Messiah, is going to be a king who is going to be great, but he's going to ride upon an ass. You know, in Matthew chapter 21, the last week of Christ's life here, before his crucifixion on Sunday, he rode into Jerusalem, putting the palms down and all of that, putting their clothes so he could ride on this donkey into the city. And Christ fulfilled that to a T. Riding upon an ass, remember what it was? It was a donkey, he said, you go get it, and no man has ever ridden on it. And I'll ride it into Jerusalem. Zechariah made that prophecy. Also, Zechariah in the 11th chapter prophesied that he's going to be betrayed, and he gives the money. How much? 30 pieces of silver. Zechariah prophesied that. And folks, this was hundreds of years before Christ came. There are lots of prophecies of Christ in the Old Testament, going all the way back to Moses. But here's Isaiah, about 500 years before the birth of Christ, prophesying he's going to be betrayed for 30 pieces of silver. Then in Zechariah chapter 12, he speaks about this great king, and he said they looked upon, this is the quote, looking upon me whom they have pierced. Does that sound familiar to you? Well, that's found in the book of John, the Gospel of John. They looked upon him whom they had pierced. Christ was pierced in the side by a Roman soldier, and out came blood that was already separating. Zechariah prophesied that. That's John chapter 19, if you're looking it up, verse 37. Then Zechariah made another statement of prophecy, and that is, they will smite the shepherd. I don't know if you remember where those words came from, but again in Matthew chapter 26, Jesus, remember the Last Supper? The establishment of what we call the Lord's Supper. And Christ predicted that the disciples would all desert him. They will smite the shepherd, Christ said, and the flock will flee. Here, Zechariah, several years, hundreds of years before Christ, prophesied that that's what the Lord would say. Zechariah also mentions this one. It's not recorded in the New Testament, but the idea is recorded in the New Testament, that this new king will reign from sea to sea. What does Christ reign over? A kingdom in the world, in the entire world. Another one, another phrase, that this new king will be the fountain for cleansing. O thou fount of every blessing. That's where this comes from. And Zechariah understood that Christ would be a blessing for all nations and for the cleansing of their soul from sin. Then, in Ephesians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul quotes another statement from Zechariah, where Zechariah said, "Speak you every man truth to his neighbor." That's not a quote from Christ, it's a quote from the Apostle Paul. So, what do we remember about Zechariah? Well, very quickly and very simply, it is a book of encouragement, and I shouldn't say book, I should say the visions of Zechariah were an encouragement to the Jews who are rebuilding the the temple in Jerusalem. And these visions make it very clear. What you're doing is important. What you're doing may not be as magnificent as the first temple, but it's going to be greater than the first. The third thing in this book is prophecy of the coming of Christ. Jesus Christ isn't the name mentioned. It's the coming of this king from the root of David, the root of Jesse. And he's going to reign. He's going to be more powerful than any king the Jews ever had. And he's going to become a sacrifice. They're going to kill him. In other words, questions related to prophecy related to Christ. I don't know what else to say unless we get into the depth of these visions. And the reason I don't want to do that is because some of them are so difficult to understand. It's like saying, I understand everything in the book of Revelation. To say that gets you in trouble right away. Okay? And like the book of Zechariah, it was written to the people of his time. And of course, the prophecies concerning Christ are not just there to have prophecies concerning the Messiah. It was there for the Jews living then to know that there's going to be a Messiah. The book of Revelation was written to the people of their time. The very first two verses say, these things must shortly come to pass. And we don't always know what those things were. So, we'll stop there. Anybody got a comment or question? If I don't, if you have a question,